Okay, we're starting in 1 Samuel chapter 20, and then we're going all the way through 22 today, so we actually have a lot of material to get through. First of all, I wanted to let me just say this is our fourth session through the life of David in 1 Samuel 20 through 22, and then it is, I think it's March 2nd today, is that correct? March 2nd, 2016. Okay, let me pray and we'll get started. Father God, thank you so much for just our time in your word and just all the lessons you've been teaching me from the life of David regarding leadership, and I'm sure these students as well. So Lord, I just pray, God, that you would just do a special work today as we study the life of David, and let it just point us to you in just a greater way as our great leader. In Jesus' name, amen. So let me just ask, how did your reflection papers go this week? Good. So, who would like to share something the Lord spoke to them? Jasper? Nope. That's okay. Just
Let me just pull it up so I can see what I don't remember.
Charlotte, I thought you were gone this week for some reason. Is that next week? Tomorrow you're leaving. Okay, come back. Exciting. Or whoever, well, Josiah's bringing it up. Go ahead.
It just kind of struck me how emotional this whole passage of the life of David was, because you have at the beginning with Jonathan and him being almost ripped apart, and then you have just throughout the whole thing, it's almost like God has been blessing and blessing and blessing and blessing David for the first part of David's life that we see. And then all of a sudden, everything that God filled up, it all comes down. Kind of like how Job, how God had filled up all of Job's wealth, and then all of a sudden Satan just ripped it all away.
Yes.
And so it was kind of really similar to that, where God's been building up David's wealth. He's building up David's name in the courts. He gave David a wife of Saul's daughter. And then all of a sudden it's all ripped away. He's a fugitive in his own land. F.B. Meyer said, behind you is the sunny morning, before you a lowering sky. Behind you the blessed enjoyment of friendship, wife, home, royal favor, and popular adulation. Before you an outcast's life.
Wow.
So I just thought it was just a really emotional passage of
scripture. Yeah, it's definitely a breaking point. A breaking point for David. And Jonathan, too. But it says David cried more, right? Yeah. And I think for that reason. Great. Shallow.
I think something that really stood out to me was that when David went to the priest, I thought it was interesting that he didn't just speak badly of Saul. He wasn't I thought it was interesting. I felt like he was almost kind of lying in a way, because he's like, I'm on a secret mission.
Yeah. That's what we call a lie, for sure.
But I thought at the same time, in some ways, that it was, he was very loyal to Saul, even though Saul wasn't like that to him. And I
totally right.
That just showed a lot about his character.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. We'll look into that, and especially the covenant that David makes with Jonathan has to do with their whole house, which would include Saul as well. And we'll see that favor still upon Saul, where David has opportunity to kill him later on in the cave and such and so forth, is that David doesn't do anything to the Lord's anointed, I think based upon that covenant that he made with Jonathan. So even though Saul's trying to take his life, David actually makes a covenant with Jonathan that protects Saul, which is just God's grace and favor upon Saul's life, even apart from his own viciousness. So I totally think that's the case. That's a wonderful observation. Tony.
I really found that point too interesting, but on the same time it was really interesting to me to see how fast and how kind of quiet David left the way of God, in a kind of, because he fears now. He's afraid of Saul suddenly, and in a kind of way he changes his point of view, and he doesn't look to God. He tried to do it on himself, and that takes him away from God. And how fast that
downward spiral,
and also in a kind of way, it wasn't really obvious.
Mm-hmm.
It was quiet and fast raising. It was really interesting to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there I think we see David probably not, I mean, when thinking back about his life, I'm sure he would not consider those proud moments of his life, and how he handled his first, the first part of his exile, if you will, from Saul. His handling of it had some serious consequences, and I think there's some lessons for leadership in those things as well. Good guy, yeah, good. I think there's some things David just had to account for later on, and we'll look at those as we go through the chapter. Yeah, let's just begin then. I'm going to have you guys do some of the reading today, just going around. I think that's great. Who'd like to read the first 2 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 20? Go ahead, Josiah.
Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so."
Okay, so here we start the beginning of this kind of extensive dialogue between David and Jonathan, in which they're going to, really sort things out in terms of determining Saul's heart for David. If it's bad, which it turns out to be, of course, is that David will have to go into exile. But this is the way that it kind of comes out. Now, what I want you to see in the text here is that obviously, we're looking at an account that is extremely pro-David. Through all the narratives, David was really lifted in high esteem through this. And one way that he's lifted in high esteem, especially in this passage, is that the relationship that he has with Jonathan shows that he's not trying to usurp the authority of the throne over Jonathan, but yet Jonathan is in a sense lifting David up to ascend beyond him. And Saul even mentions that and says that, and there's some truth that comes out from Saul, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So that's kind of the theme that's going on. If you're wondering, why is this in the Bible? Well, it's really painting the picture of David as not a man that's trying to take over the throne from Saul, to do Saul in. Neither is he trying to take the throne of Saul away or take the throne away from Jonathan, who's first in line to ascend to the throne. But yet it's all coming through this covenant relationship that Jonathan has with David, that we see how David is given the throne, in fact, by Jonathan. Now, ultimately, it's given to him by God, right? It's not Jonathan that's giving the throne. Ultimately, God anointed him for this, the beginning. But this is how it's working out. And so it's really favorable to David, where David's not just trying to slide in there. He's not trying to assemble an army to revolt against Saul or anything like that. But it's really, the matter of it is that David and Jonathan are kind of working this out in an intimate relationship, intimate friendship relationship that has this as a result. Now, I don't know that many stories of like kind of kingly authority and those sorts of things, but I'll have to say that there's probably not too many stories like this in a universal setting. Think about it this way, right? And you'll read about it. I guarantee there's not another story of this within the Bible of something like this, where you have a king, and the king's son has a close relation to a friend, and that king's son tries to hand the throne over to his friend, right? Which makes for just an incredible story, which we're seeing right here. But it's in the history of the kings of Judah or the kings of Israel. If you remember, Judah and Israel are a divided kingdom for some times, and Kings and Chronicles really details the history of the kings of Israel, the history of the kings of Judah. You don't find a story like this at all. So this is very special and unique, and ultimately because of God's anointing. Most of the time what happens is that there's a king in place, and then somebody assassinates him in order to become king in their place, right? Or they kill the present king, and they kill all the king's family members, because those guys could come back to bite them in the end when they become king. So there's this whole kind of culture of really assassination when it comes to taking over the kingly authority and such and so forth. And the whole object of being a king and authority during that time is, man, you just hung on as hard as you could, and then you knew that your life was constantly in danger, because some of the kings of Israel and Judah only lasted like a year to a couple of years to a couple of months, depending on who it was, right? It was actually a job position that was pretty hazardous to be the king over Israel or Judah, and you learn that as you read through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Anyway, so this is a very special story that's very different from any other story within the Bible, and it really shows David in a favorable life, not trying to climb his way to the top of the heap in any regard, but it really, the way that he's really brought into authority here, at least at this level in this part of the story, is through his intimate friendship with Jonathan, which is very unique. Okay, so, but here's the deal. In this first section of Scripture, it's not clear that Jonathan really even knows that his dad has murderous intentions of David. Now, it's kind of funny in the fact that Saul at this point has tried to kill him twice with the spear. It's like, at this point, my dad, no way he would have that. Well, he's already thrown a spear at me twice, right? He's already tried to kill me twice. But so it seems a little unfounded. It seems like maybe he doesn't have the right understanding. But if you look later in the past, later within the with 1 Samuel, you'll see that Saul and Jonathan actually don't have like a distant relationship from one another. Yeah, I think David gets in the center of it, and that's the main reason that their relationship has deteriorated, because Saul doesn't have the same perspective on David that Jonathan does. But if you see, ultimately they're fighting battles together. There's you can see that there's a sense of closeness in their relationship that is really being aggravated by David. So it's not like Jonathan's a distant party right here. And here it seems like he's actually on the side of his dad to some degree. He says, "Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It's not so." Like, we're so close that this wouldn't even happen, and nothing like this could ever happen. So now let's just read 3 or 4. I won't do this the whole session, but at least we'll read some of it together. Shiloh, you want to read 3 and 4?
Yeah. But David vowed again, saying, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your sight." And he had said, "Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be worried. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death." Then Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you."
Okay. So David takes an oath, so it's almost like he's swearing at this point. He's like, "I swear, I know that your dad has it out for me." And he gives specific reasons why Jonathan wouldn't know about this, because Saul would be hiding from it. He knows his friendship with David was close, but at the end he extends this offer to David, saying, "I will do it. Whatever you yourself your desire, I will do it for you." Okay. Because David says there's no step between me and death. He's like, he sees it coming just right down the line, and Jonathan's willing to side with David and do anything for him. Okay? So David has a plan in place. It's kind of interesting to think is that David is the anointed of the Lord. God has specifically anointed him to be king over Israel. He's not over king of Israel yet. But then there's this interplay between David having to execute these various plans in order to test Saul's heart, to figure it out once he's in exile, all these other things. And it seems like, and I don't know if you can take the positive perspective on this or not, but even this thing about going to sacrifice at Bethlehem, it doesn't seem like that's apparently the case as well. Maybe he went to do that, maybe he didn't. But the whole idea behind it was not that he did it. The fact is that he's going to be absent, and they're going to judge Saul's response as a result of that. Okay? So David's kind of having to devise these plans. Now, in this case, you might actually call it wisdom. You're like, okay, I just need to see the cards on the table here to see what's going on in Saul's heart, to really know if I need to get out of here or not. What's Saul's real perspective on me? Sometimes you'll look at a leader, or you'll look at your boss or something like that. You're like, what does my boss really think about me? And you couldn't really ask them to their face, but in the end, you'd like to know that. You have some understanding of what your boss actually thinks of you in the kind of the raw form. Well, here's David's plan in order to really figure that out. Okay, it goes on with verses 5 through 9. Tony, would you like to read that?
Verse 9?
Yeah.
And David said to Jonathan, "Indeed, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king to eat. But let me go, that I may hide in the field until the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, the city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he says thus, it is well, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that the evil is determined by him. Therefore, you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is impunity in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? But Jonathan said, Far be it from you, for if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you.
Okay. So you see here how it's being tested, and actually it's a pretty interesting thing. If David's there, if David's not there, how is it going to be evaluated? Is Saul going to say, "Oh, it's okay. I'm glad he's gone on for to do that thing at his parents' house in Bethlehem"? If he's very angry, then he'll know that there's a problem there. And the whole idea is that I think Saul's jealousy and his anger actually is his downfall here, and David is able to, in a sense that by this kind of test that he has laid out. It is interesting to see that that Saul's anger would actually be his downfall. And if you look at qualities and characteristics of leaders, is that this is something that can stumble a leader often. Does the leader become angry or sensitive to just little things that happen? Do they get mad over nothing? We've all seen leaders like that can't control their temper and control their anger, and Saul was certainly one of those guys. And David was able to determine that just by this simple test of saying, if he's not there, then what is he going to say? What is he going to say about that? So I think there's a real leadership lesson too. And all of our patience is tested. All of us become angry at a time. There's no problem with that. But the Bible says clearly about anger. Can you think about some of the passages that the Bible says about anger?
Ephesians 5.
Yes. What's Ephesians 5? Good. That's a good one. In your anger,
Don't sin.
yeah, in your anger, do not sin, right? Can you think of another one?
Don't let the sun go down in your anger.
Don't let your sun go down in your anger, which I think is also from Ephesians chapter 5 right there, right? Any other passages that you can think regarding anger? There's actually a lot of them in Proverbs, but I couldn't name the verse. Is that it talks about the wrathful man and the downfall of the wrathful man. Is that all?
Anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Anger of man is... There you go. That's what I was thinking, is the book of James has those things too. So just think about that. When you become angry, the things that you say and what comes out of your mouth, right? Well, it could be really have serious consequences, and the higher you are up in leadership, the more consequences that those things have. So just keep a watch over your anger. We all tend to be angry at times, but I can remember times right here in this church where the anger that I exhibited at certain situations and certain things were happening, I did it in an ungodly way, and there was definitely consequences for that, right? Because we're all tested. Wherever you work at, whatever your job is, I guarantee that you're going to get mad. I can almost guarantee it. The question is not whether you get mad, but then how you handle your anger, all right? In your relationship at home, with your roommates, right? And guys are getting mad at Jesper, because he kind of snores a little bit loud. No, he doesn't. I'm saying,
That's true. That's a constant conversation we have.
really? Is that? Wow. Gift of prophecy. I don't know. The Lord of the Lord.
I thought you had heard us complain.
No.
We talk about all the time.
Yeah, I was like, wow. Is there a chainsaw down on Olive Street?
Drew shares a room with Jesper and David, and they're the two loudest snorers, so Drew never sleeps.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because you can't switch rooms.
Yeah, who would want to be in there, right? Hey, man, that's okay. It's just you're just communicating in your sleep. That's why I like to think
I
about.
also do.
Do you really?
In Swedish.
It's Swedish? How do you know?
Because True, yeah.
He tells you can't understand. That's kind of better though, right? That he can't understand anything you're saying. Glad. Okay. Well, that's interesting too. Anyway, that's really fun. So yeah, just consider that and test the leadership. And there's going to be times where you just.
Is this the Wart seminar class?
Yes, Scott DePar. So funny. So there will be situations in which you will be tested in that. So it's always good to evaluate your words at this time. To be angry but not sin. David, maybe I'll have Jesper read this next part then, verses 10 through 17. Do you want to read that, Jesper?
Then David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me if what your father answers you is harsh?" And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out to the field." So the two of them went out to the field. Then Jonathan said to David, "Yahweh, the God of Israel, is my witness, that I will question my father by this time the day after tomorrow. And look, if he is well disposed toward you, will I not send word to you and disclose it to you? So may Yahweh punish Jonathan and more if my father decides to do you harm, and if I fail to disclose it to you and send word to you that you can go safely. And may Yahweh be with you as he has been with my father. And not while I am still alive, will you not show the loyal love of Yahweh with me, that I may not die? And do not cut off your loyal love from my family forever, not even when Yahweh exterminates each of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May Yahweh call the enemies of David to account." And Jonathan again made David swear an oath, because he loved him. For the love of his soul, he loved him.
Okay, great. Wonderful. It's so we're talking about there the specific covenant that David makes with Jonathan. Remember, this has been mentioned in chapters past. Do you remember the covenant that he's made with David? Again, that characteristic of Hebrew narrative in which the summation is the summary or the summation is mentioned, and then the specifics are mentioned later on. And we're seeing that again right here, right? So don't get tripped up. Did God make two covenants with David make two covenants with Jonathan, or did he make one covenant? Well, really, he made one covenant. It's just the way that the Hebrew narrative lays it out, summarizing it at certain points, but then laying it out in detail at these points. So it's good to understand that about how this happens. If you look at the specifics, what are the specifics of the covenant that he's making with Jonathan right there? You guys see? What are some of the things? Maybe around 13 through 17, do you see anything? Aspects of that covenant that he makes with Jonathan?
That Jonathan will tell him about what Saul's feeling.
Okay, that's part of it, is that he's going to say. And then, but then, if it doesn't go well, then what are some of the aspects of that covenant that I mentioned later on? Yes. Yeah. Okay. While they're still alive. So they'll both show loving kindness to one another and faithfulness to one another during their life. That's the first aspect of it. And then the second aspect?
May the Lord take them.
So it's with Jonathan while he's still alive, but then what's the other aspect?
Oh, do not cut your steadfast love from my house forever?
Yes, exactly. So he also says then for the Jonathan's lineage that covenant would then extend to that as well, and vice versa. So, and then we see actually David uphold the covenant a little bit later on. Do you remember who it's with?
Starts with a J, I think.
No, it starts with an M, but it's close. Could have been Jesus, but no, that's
Jonathan's son, right?
Yeah, he's lame.
Yeah.
Mephibosheth. Yeah, Mephibosheth. There you go. You just didn't remember the right letter that it started with. So Mephibosheth is one of those guys, and Saul particularly does kindness too. You don't remember Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth?
Ah,
How do you say it?
Mephibosheth. It's a German way.
Oh, that's the German way to see it?
Or
Mephibosheth?
like our way.
Oh.
Sure, the early-
Okay, I can see that. Yeah, that was a perfect pronunciation, Tony, too. I think you say it better than I say Mephibosheth. That'll actually be on the test, is say Mephibosheth 7 times as fast as you possibly can. All right. So anyway, so that's one way that he upholds that covenant with the house of Jonathan. And actually, if you remember, Saul is executed by, it's not by David. So anyway, so that promise and that vow is upheld between these two men. If you look at the substance of that, it's not a substance of fear that David's going to do something wrong with him, but really it's a vow because he loved him, for he loved him as his own soul. I can't think about two friends in the Bible up to this point, or even beyond this point, in which had the closeness of the friendship of David and Jonathan. It's amazing to see how much detail that this friendship and this intimate love for one another is really detailed within 1 Samuel right here, the closeness of them. I can only think of the relationship between the Apostle John and Jesus as even coming close to this in that way. Remember that John laid his head upon Jesus' breast in the upper room, and he considered himself the disciple that Jesus loved. That was his description of himself within the New Testament. But yet still, look at this, the way that this relationship between Jonathan and David is detailed. Okay. Just then, continuing on then to 18, I'll just go ahead and read this. Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place where you hid on the day of the deed, and remain by the stone Izal. Then I will shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a target, and there I will send a lad, saying, 'Go find the arrows.' If I expressly say to the lad, 'Look, the arrows are on this side of you, come get them and come,' then as the Lord lives, there's safety for you and no harm. But if I say thus to the young man, 'Look, the arrows are beyond you,' go your way, for the Lord has sent you away, and for the matter which you and I have spoken of, indeed the Lord be between you and me and forever." It's interesting that this is the particular thing that's being laid out by Jonathan is the shooting of the arrows. Of course, the arrows are a weapon, and David is a man of war, and this is obviously in the context of physical war between Saul and David that will come to see that Jonathan actually throws his spear. Saul throws his spear at Jonathan. So there's definitely there's that military analogy, and there's that military culture. But there's also really the sense in which David is being sent off by the arrow going beyond him, if that's going to be the case, as we'll see. 24, it says, "Then David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. Now the king sat on a seat, and as other times on a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, 'Something has happened to him. He is unclean. Surely he is unclean.' And it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, 'Why has the son of Jesse not come to eat either yesterday or today?'" Okay, so it could be, though, that the reason that David is gone is because David is planning some sort of rebellion. You can imagine that when the king wants everybody to show up, everybody needs to show up. And if you don't show up, there better be a pretty good reason that you don't, all right, because it'd be kind of violating the king's command. I should say that Israel did celebrate the feast of the new moon, a special sacrifice at the beginning of every month, because of course the month is based upon the 28-day calendar of the moon. So this is something that's prescribed in Numbers, but of course the occasion of it then sets up, okay, now I'm checking in with everybody that's on my military team, and everybody's accounted for and good, and I know exactly what everybody's doing, which is very, very necessary here. And Abner, who we'll see come into play as Saul's kind of right-hand man, military commander, is also mentioned here, and he'll become significant later on in the story of David as well. If you see the way that David's being referred to, it's almost in a diminutive way. He's called the son of Jesse. Remember, Jesse is just like this sheep herder guy from the backwoods town of Bethlehem. So even though it's not, it's weird. Jonathan is never called the son of Saul, right? He has his own specific name. But David is becoming the son of Jesse, which is kind of a diminutive name, kind of pointing to his humble origins. It's like, yeah, you're a warrior, but you still have to remember that you came from poverty. Okay, so I don't know. That's just one way of reading that, of course. Continuing on to 28, it says this, so Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem, and he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. Now if I found favor in your eyes, please let me get away and see my brothers. Therefore he has not come to the king's table. And Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Okay, never say that to somebody, guys. Okay, especially to a lady. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew it was determined by his father to kill David. Okay? And so, again, this kind of test is sort of laid out about the sacrifice we've already referred to. And then we see Saul giving into anger, which ultimately will indicate that he's about ready to take David's life. Then, in fact, he does have murderous intentions against David. We see this curse against Jonathan, which is very interesting, just because of his anger toward David. Okay, and I don't know anything about this curse, but let me tell you that this doesn't sound like a good one. Again, it sounds like if Jonathan is actually referred to by these characteristics as perverse and rebellious, just because he's been, born of his mother, wouldn't significantly assign these to his mother. This is an insult to him as well. And talking about the shame of his mother's nakedness, this is like saying that this is actually an act that is almost like your mom being uncovered, okay, of your mom being publicly naked, which in that culture being seen as publicly naked is obviously a very shameful thing. It would be a shameful thing within this society as well. Remember, Jesus was crucified naked because of the shame, a shameful way of being that the Romans executed people during that time. So public nudity, definitely a shame within this culture, and it's a tremendous insult against Jonathan as well.
Could it also be a hint on the action that Jonathan gave his robe to David and naked himself in a kind of a way that he gave the reign over Israel to him?
That's a possibility. But I don't think that the giving of the robe, I think that has to do with the special insignia that's on the robe as a king's son. So I don't think that's necessarily Jonathan uncovering himself as much as handing over royalty, or that David is in the next line of succession. This specifically has to do with the shame of nakedness. Okay. We'll see it later on. If you remember that later on, after Saul, well, when David becomes king, remember he sends that garrison of people to some city. I can't remember the specifics of it, just as a kind of a warm well-wishing to the king of that city. And then they're all kind of paranoid, like David's just trying to look at the strongholds and all this. And he ends up shaving the guys, and then they cut the robes off to this length, so they kind of go back with just their kind of naked buttocks, I don't know if you remember this. Remember the story. We'll get to it. I promise. Okay, now you guys are going to be reading the life of David all night. But that's that same principle. That's that same principle of just public nakedness is really a sign of shame. And again, he's saying these things to his own son, calling him perverse, rebellious, as a shame to his mother, just as if his mother was publicly nude. And then he says some truth there. You see it in verse 31, as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom, right? Is that this man is going to take over, and I know that. So in one sense, his anger isn't unfounded, or his emotions aren't unfounded, but he just handles them in exactly the opposite way. It's almost like he should have just taken a step down and said, okay, I'll go back to what I was going to do before, because I know the Spirit of the Lord has left me. He knows the Spirit's departed him. And in a sense, he can say, we know right here that he believes David is the next person to take over the throne. It's because he tries to hold on so much that this becomes all his trouble.
Wasn't when he originally being made king, when he was made king, didn't want to be?
Oh yeah, you're right. Well, he was hiding. Yeah, you're right. He was hiding among the baggage, and they had to kind of pull him out. And they're like, "Where's Saul?" And God's like, "He's in the baggage." And so they had to go search the baggage and pull Saul out.
So do you think that at this point it's just because of all the power that he has and like the comfort?
Yes. Yeah. I think once you have the position, I think you tend to want to hold on to the position because of, I think it's just obvious reasons, right? The authority that comes with it, the prestige. I'm sure there's tremendous financial stability that comes from being the king. Would you just be killed if you weren't the king, for example? If David took over, would you be executed at that point? So I think there's a fear of his life. Now, I don't think those things would be handled in an ungodly way, because if this is the thing that God has set up, then God's going to take care of Saul if he would actually have done the right thing. I don't think it would have been an automatic death sentence, especially for the fact that Jonathan and David had made this covenant to basically protect one another's houses at the expense of their life. If you remember, the covenants that were made at that time were really to the death of one of them, to the death of the person that broke the covenant if they broke the covenant. So this is a serious deal. It wasn't just like, hey, okay, now I got your back if you got mine, and then maybe some things happen and it isn't so much the way anymore. I mean, this is a serious covenant for life that David ends up honoring much later in his life because he remembers this covenant that he made with Jonathan. So, again, it says, Jonathan answered Saul's father, said to him, "Why should he be killed? What has he done?" When Jonathan is asked to deliver David to him. It's kind of interesting at this point. It seems like Saul has really seen through the scheme of what David is doing here in this kind of test of the new moon, because he asked Jonathan specifically to bring him. It's almost like he knows that Jonathan knows the whereabouts of David, and if he's the person that David's confided in where he's gone, then Jonathan should be the guy that would be able to bring him out so that Saul could kill him. Again, Saul is testing Jonathan's heart at this point as well, right? He said, hey, if your loyalty is to me, you're going to bring this guy out, and he's going to, and I'm going to kill him. So if you're loyal to me, do this for me so that we can take care of this guy right now, right? I don't think Jonathan's even thinking that he's going to do that, but that's what his dad commands him to do. Now, of course, Jonathan can't do that because he was already made his great love for David, the covenant that he's made with David. He can't do that. That covenant actually protects Saul, is the ironic thing about this whole situation, right? Is it protects Saul's life because David isn't going to do anything to Saul. Saul's just going to, end his life on his own accord, right? And we'll look at that later. Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him. If there's a lesson there, is that don't just constantly have a spear in your hand, or like an insult. It's like whenever Saul has a spear in his hand, it seems like there's some trouble that happens as a result of it, right? What if he just didn't have the spear? It would have gone so much better for him. And I just think, sometimes we just have that word, that spear that we're going to throw at somebody, that insult that we want to say. We know what we want to say, and we know it's just right on the tip of our tongue to say it. Just don't say it, right? Take the spear out of your hand is what I would suggest. Make sure that you're listening, not just for your opportunity to speak next. A lot of times, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I know that if I said something that it would really just burn somebody. But I say, no, I'm not going to say it. But if I do say it, then I often regret that situation, and I reap the consequences for that. So it's better just to stay quiet in those situations where you have something that will really hurt the other person. Anyway, that's really what we're dealing with right there. 34 through 39 goes like this at the end of the chapter. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. Again, that curse that he gave him, telling him that was just as if he had uncovered his mother. And so it was in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. Then he said to the lad, "Now run, find the arrows which I shoot." As the lad ran, he shot an arrow behind him, When the lad had come to the place where the arrow was which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried out after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" And Jonathan cried out after the lad, "Make haste, hurry, do not delay." So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master, but the lad didn't know anything. Only Jonathan and David knew of this matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, "Go carry them into the city." And again, Jonathan's able to get away with this because he has the young lad with him. He has the bows, the arrows. It looks like he's just going out to shoot. He's doing nothing more than that. The lad doesn't know anything of it. He ends up sending the lad in. Obviously, the sign is that the arrows would be beyond him, and that's all that he would know about. But then we're going to see this kind of rendezvous between David and Jonathan in the last part of the chapter. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed down 3 times. And they kissed one another, and they wept together, but David more. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since we have both been sworn in the name of the Lord, saying that may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. Again, this brings up the quote that Josiah just read right there. Just that this would be this is really a new beginning for David. This is when he's leaving his military career behind with Saul. Remember, he has a wife, Michal, that's also back there. I don't think it's mentioned that he has any children by this point, but he's definitely leaving his old life behind at this point, and he knows that he's in for it. Where would David go? I'm sure he didn't even know where he'd go. Anywhere where he would go, if he went to Bethlehem to stay with his parents, I mean, that would bring punishment upon his parents. Anywhere that he would go within Israel, he would face, except the wilderness, would he face retribution, and whoever he was with would face retribution. And that's why he fled Ramah to begin with, Samuel's house. He couldn't stay anywhere. He was really a fugitive at that point. I'm sure he looked at it in that way as well. He fell on his face to the ground. Personally, I think that has a reference to David, his first response to this, that he would glorify God, that he would worship God even in the midst of this situation. And we're going to look later to some Psalms that he begins to write. It was obvious that he was already writing Psalms by this point, but I think that's just an attitude of worship. No matter what situation David was in, he was able to worship God. Go ahead.
Was Samuel at that moment still alive?
Yes.
But do you think didn't led David to Samuel?
He started off, if you look at the beginning of the chapter, remember, and I should have prefaced this, that was my fault, Tony, is that at the very beginning of the chapter, we see, remember, Saul's like laying down naked, prophesying, and that's also at Ramah at the school of the prophets. So that's where David was, because remember, Saul's sending all these messengers to him saying, "Hey man, you bring back David," and then all the guys are just like, overcome by the Spirit, and they're all just laying around, and Saul himself goes, and then Saul's prophesying as well. But then at the beginning of the chapter, in 1 Samuel 20, we see David fleeing Ramah. He couldn't just stay there forever, right? Mm-hmm. Saul's eventually going to wake up from his kind of spiritual enthusiasm and return to normal, so David actually has to flee. He's a fugitive at this point, but the point is that it hasn't been definitively laid out that he will have to be exiled. So he needed to test Saul's heart out to really see, is Saul really have just these murderous intentions before me? If that's the case, then I just need to create a new life. And that's essentially what he's doing right here. It's quite a predicament to be in. If you think about it from David's angle, as a devotional aspect, he's probably thinking, okay, God, where are you? I mean, I'm anointed to be king of Israel, but I'm completely having to leave my life of being a military commander with Saul and Saul's personal assistants. In fact, I'm being exiled, and I'm going to be a fugitive just out here in the wilderness by myself now. God, what is it that you're doing? Where are you right now? You can imagine that would be some of the thoughts that were going through David's head. In fact, it would be bad for him and anybody else for him to stay in Israel. The way he handles it isn't appropriate, as we're going to see in the next 2 chapters. The other thing there is that they're both crying at this point because their friendship would never be the same either. Jonathan didn't decide to go with David at this point, right? Jonathan went back to the palace. Even though he had that bout of anger with his dad and that shameful treatment by his dad, he still went back to the palace, right? He couldn't leave that life. David had to go into it on his own. So their friendship would never be the same after this. In fact, I don't know how many encounters they would have after this, and I'm not sure if there was any, in fact. So this would be an end to their friendship as well. Jonathan, in fact, says, "Go in peace to honor the covenant between Saul and David." And yes, this is quite a bleak path that David's on, but he can trust the Lord that God will help him as he walks on through this. So again, we see the kind of the ending and the conclusion of Jonathan's relationship with David. They're both weeping. Obviously showing those signs of intimacy. When it says that they kissed, this isn't, again, any kind of homosexual undertones or anything like that, but just the expression of love for one another and being friends with one another. Again, we see a great message of friendship here and what it means to be close-knit with somebody, to be there for them in the midst of the adversity they're kind of going through, and it's really being held up as an exemplar of a close male friendship. It's interesting is that I can't even think of female friendships that are really outlined within the Bible that are even as close as that of David and Jonathan. The only one that I can think of is a relationship between Ruth and Naomi, a very close relationship where she says, "Hey, you don't even have to go with me," and Naomi says, "No, I'm going with you." All right, so there are those examples, but this is definitely the most detailed of intimate friendship that we see within the Word that I'm made a known of, or aware of. Did you have? Okay, great. Continuing on there with 1 Samuel chapter 21. In this, we're going to see how David's handling the first aspects of his exile, and let me tell you, it doesn't go very well. As you've already read about, and as you already know, again, leadership is really tested in the crucible of circumstances. And of course, we're seeing how David handles these first circumstances. You have to think from your position, though, how would you handle such extenuating circumstances in your own life? So we don't want to, judge David too harshly as a result of this. And of course, we can't absolve Saul from his responsibility and the brutality that ends up happening within this section of Scripture as well. So. We have to, but again, David, he's a man after God's own heart, but here we see his human side as well, and it's the fabrication, I believe, that he produced about the new moon festival to test Saul's heart, kind of led into the fact that he was now able to tell yet another fabrication to Ahimelech the priest that we're going to see here in verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, 'Why are you alone, and no one is with you?' So David said to Ahimelech the priest, 'The king has ordered me on some business, and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place.'" Okay, so he comes to this place in Nob, and he goes into the house of the Lord. Now that's a good move, right? Going into the house of the Lord, he's going in to inquire of God, and we're going to find out that he is hungry, so that's kind of one of his motivations. But still, he turns to the house of the Lord. He doesn't go anywhere else. He doesn't, do anything that's wrong at this point. But he goes in there. The problem is when the priest sees him, the priest knows him. He says, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" Which looks kind of fishy. Now we don't know at this point whether the details of David's kind of dire relationship with Saul was kind of broadcast over Israel. It seems like from the front page news, it looks like Saul and David are really working well together. Saul has slain his thousands, David has slain his 10,000s after the victory of the Philistines there. It seems like David is elevated to the point of the personal assistant. He's Saul's personal minstrel, and looks good on those accounts. Now we don't know again that there's things that are happening within the palace with the throwing of the spear at David twice, and then, of course, the occasion that this went down that he would not know about. But so we don't know if that's broadcast throughout Israel or not at this point. We don't know if Ahimelech would know about it. We do know that he was afraid because he was alone. Okay, David is usually with, I'm sure, he's a captain of thousands, if you remember from our previous chapter, not today's study, but the last one. He's made captain over 1,000. He's going out to fight these battles, and now he's by himself. Was it that David suffered a massive defeat, and now he's headed back through Nob? Is it that, there's a rebellion that's going on that Ahimelech doesn't know about, but there's a sense of fear there. We're not sure what it's to do with, but we know that at least it's because David is alone. David, here's where he generates the fabrication that Saul has ordered me on some business, and don't let anybody know about the business. So it's actually a cleverly devised fabrication, much like the new moon sacrifice thing that he generated earlier. It seems like David had a real creative mind that allowed him to write the Psalms, but then it could also be put to this purpose to produce some pretty devious lies as well. And so we see that right here. I've directed my young men to such and such a place. So here's where the young men are. It's not that I've lost the young men or that they've been defeated by the Philistines, whatever the case may be, but I had to direct them on some special king's business. It says, now therefore, what have you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there's no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread if the young men have at least kept themselves from the women. Then David answered the priest and said to him, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. So the priest gave him holy bread. Oh, sorry, Josiah.
No, keep going.
Oh, okay. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there, but the showbread which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away.
So, is it wrong for David to lie in this time of war?
I think it is. I think that I still think it would have gone well with it would have gone better with Ahimelech in this situation if David had told the truth. I think things would have worked out differently, and possibly Ahimelech would have been able to exit with David at that point. I mean, it's hard to know what would have happened.
Because isn't there a chance that if David, well, obviously Ahimelech will die as a result of helping David.
Yes.
But if David tells Ahimelech, oh, well, I'm on the run from Saul, and Ahimelech still helps David, then it's almost certain that Ahimelech is going to die. As opposed to keeping Ahimelech, I don't know, innocent, maybe? I don't know. I just thought that
right.
David was trying to protect Ahimelech.
Yes, you can say that. I mean, this in a sense protects David, and it protects Ahimelech, because who knows what Ahimelech might have done. I mean, him and his 85 priests or whatever, they could have taken David to Saul. I mean, it just depends on, we have no idea what their loyalty is at this point. So we see David do this, but then we see, at least the way that the text outlines the consequences of the lie, and we see just from the Word of God's perspective on the position of the lie, Ahimelech stands up there and he's like, hey, I'm innocent, I really didn't know what was going on, and him and all his fellow priests get hacked to pieces. I mean, wow, okay, that's some pretty serious consequences of the lie that David tells. But again, I mean, Saul has his own responsibility. Doeg has his own responsibility within this too. It's the same kind of question. I'll get to you in a second, Shadow. It's the same kind of question when you look at those circumstances of people hiding Jews during World War II in Germany, right? Is that they're, hey, do you guys have any Jews here? No, we don't have any Jews here. What if they had said yes and told the truth, right? Should they have told the truth in the circumstance when it compromises the lives of valuable people, that they've hidden? And so, I mean, that comes up again and again as a moral and an ethical issue, and there's definitely both sides of those things. But as Christians, we have the belief that if God tells us not to lie, then He's going to protect us from the results of the He's going to protect us in those circumstances where we've told the truth. That the truth actually will set us free, right? The truth isn't anything that actually binds us up. Actually, it's the deceptions that we tell that bind us up. It's really the truth that we tell us to set us free. Now, I don't know how I would be supernaturally, maybe Ahimelech would be supernaturally delivered in a situation like this. But it's possible. Or David would be delivered in a situation like this. Remember, he's been anointed king over Israel. He doesn't need to lie to get there. Right? It doesn't matter what would have happened. If Ahimelech tried to bind him up and send him to Saul, it wouldn't have mattered, right? David would escape because God had already anointed him for that position. I mean, he had the golden ticket. But the thing is he wasn't always acting like he had the golden ticket, right? And since he didn't act like it, part of it, his consequences get him in trouble. Now, can I say that I wouldn't have done what he did in a circumstance like this if I was running for my life and the only way that I was going to be able to get some food was to lie to get it? It would have been just as challenging for me. I don't think you could say in that circumstance what you would have done either, right? I mean, we want to think that we would have done the moral and the upstanding thing, but then again, we're not in David's situation, so we don't want to be throwing stones at a man that we haven't walked a mile in his shoes. So, but on the other hand, we can't, it was clearly commanded by God to not lie, so he's going to face those consequences of having not told the truth. Go ahead, Shiloh.
You think he could have been thinking it was like a covenant he needed to keep to somehow like with the kindness and lovingness to not like kind of be like, yo, it's all like a bad king type thing, or not really?
Yeah, huh.
And if it had been, what would he have had to do in that situation if like the oath that he took was almost like making him tell a lie? Or is that just
Well, okay, when I think about the testimony that he how far do you go to defend somebody that you've made that covenant with? Would you lie on their behalf? In a sense, like Jonathan did for David to test Saul's heart. Again, I think you wouldn't want to uphold the covenant that you make with another human person above the covenant that you have with God, with the relationship that you have with God. So I'd always say that is your first and primary relationship that you have to please, and then other relationships would then be underneath that covenant. You can't, it's useless to obey men rather than God. You have to obey God rather than men in a situation like that. If somebody asks you to lie for them, even though you might have that kind of covenant relationship, I don't think that you would violate your relationship with God in order to fulfill your covenant with another person. That's, I guess, my answer on that. Though I understand there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of gray area in this kind of stuff where, hey, the lie is done to justifiably get out of a situation that he shouldn't have been in to begin with. It wasn't his fault that he was exiled. He had done nothing wrong. So, that was the truth of the matter. But that doesn't then make him do like whatever I need to do to survive kind of situation, which that's what ultimately kind of gets him in trouble. So the application from this, though, is that you will be placed in circumstances in which you will be tested in terms of your morality, your ethics, and your character when you're in positions of leadership. You will. There'll be a lot of gray areas, and you'll really have to look to the Lord to give you wisdom in situations, because a lot of times when we're in a situation, our judgment can get clouded, right? And the weight of the circumstances and the swirl of things around him. Think about the emotional place that David was in at this point, right? The Bible already says that David cried more. This is the end of his friendship with Jonathan. We can't underestimate. This is his best bud that he's going to be separated from. That's an emotional thing. He just ended up crying with this guy and having to leave his old life behind. Now he's put in a situation of moral and ethical compromise, right? Out of that emotional situation. This guy's judgment is clouded, right? It's clouded at the least. And so, again, I don't want to come down on him too hard because he's dealing with a situation like this and he's making decisions out of a very emotionally distraught place. So I don't want to hold that against him in any way. I think we have to have grace and compassion upon David for just the circumstances that he's in right now, and to say, what would we do if we were in similar circumstances? But I guarantee this will be the case. You will be in a position of leadership. God will have you there, and then there will be all these circumstances that will surround you. Your judgment will be clouded, and you'll have no idea what to do. I guarantee it'll happen to you. It's happened to me before. And the only way that you're going to be able to figure it out is to, first of all, look to the Word, look to prayer, and then look to the wise counsel of people around you. If I could say it like that. Those are the Word, prayer, and then the wise counsel of people around you will help you make those decisions where your judgment is very clouded. Unfortunately, David didn't have access to any of this, right? You look where he's at. He's by himself, right? He already visited Samuel at Ramah, and he couldn't do anything there, right? He didn't have any place else to go in Israel, else he'd bring shame to, or he'd bring a punishment to his father's house or whatever. He's just totally on his own right now, and I think that's part of the problem. So he needs 5 loaves of bread. So he's like starving right now. He can't get any food. He needs 5 loaves of bread. He knows that there's food within the tabernacle. The showbread is again the presence bread that is required to be in the tabernacle all the time. It's evidence of basically of Israel's continual fellowship with God. That's the whole idea of the showbread within the tabernacle. Okay. It's evidence of, this is what we're sharing bread with God, and that's why it's continually baked every day, and there's a fresh loaf, and what David ends up asking for is the day-old bread that that the fresh bread replaces. Really, this Leviticus 24:9 says that the showbread should only be eaten by Aaron and his sons. So really, it was considered to be. Oh, no, I'm sorry, this doesn't say only. It says, and it shall be for Aaron and his sons, they shall eat it in a holy place. So again, is that the bread is actually reserved for Aaron and his sons for the Aaronic priesthood, specifically for that. Go ahead.
So was it sin for David to have eaten this bread, or could it be considered like, I don't know, God's choosing of people over religion?
I think that's it. If you look to kind of the commentary on it from Jesus himself, if you remember, Jesus actually refers to this. Okay, this is really cool. Yeah, turn to Matthew chapter 12. That's cool. Is that I don't need to answer this question. Let's just have Jesus answer it, right? Matthew 12. And look at this first 1 through 8 there. It says, at the time that Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. The Pharisees saw it. They said, look, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not been condemned. You would have not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Okay, so again, the disciples or Jesus is being accused of working on the Sabbath. And taking, any kind of harvesting principle, at least during that time, was considered work upon the Sabbath, even when the disciples took little bits of grain and, ate them off the stalk right there. And then Jesus quotes this passage, and even though he's right that it was unlawful for David to eat the showbread, it's really out of the mercy of God that God supplies the needs of his people. And so even though in principle just eating bread out of the tabernacle would be seen as an unlawful act, just if you're just trying to get a manner of getting food. In the case where you have a man that's really hungry and needs sustenance, that the mercy of God is above this kind of just a legal constraint. Now the bread is for the priest, right? To supply the need of the priest. It's not like just a ritualistic kind of thing where the bread is only eaten by the priest because it needs to be digested by the priest or something like that. So that's not the principle there. It's that this is just a way of supplying for the priest's needs. Just the same way that sacrifices and that the animals left after the sacrifice also supplied the need of the priest on a daily basis, right? Part of it was the sacrifice to the Lord, but part of it was also is that the priest got to eat the meat. So that's the way that the needs of the priest were supplied for. And Jesus is basically saying this is the same thing, is that there's a guy in need here that needs to eat, and therefore that is the principle that we should be operating on, not just, hey, wait a second, this guy's not a son of Aaron, so he shouldn't eat the showbread kind of thing. So again, God's not into legalism, he's into mercy more than legalism, and that's the point that he's making in Matthew chapter 12. So it doesn't seem like, at least from the biblical perspective, that that's considered anything wrong, and the priest doesn't address it as anything wrong too. The only thing he says, he's like, okay, well, let's just make it like it would have been a son of Aaron to some degree, and make sure that you guys are ceremonial clean, that you've kept yourself from the ladies. And of course, there's an application to all the men at Olive Street House to just keep yourself from the ladies. Okay, good. I'm just kidding. I shouldn't have brought that in there. That's why we have you in one dorm. We don't let you guys go over to the other house, right, Shiloh? So that's it. So the priest gave him the holy bread. There was a showbread, and so that's what he was fed by. Now here's the thing, right? Is that when Ahimelech is there and giving the bread to David, now we see this guy Doeg show up. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, this is verse 7, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, is there not on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Elah. There it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it, for there is no other except that one here. David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. Okay, so gnarly, right? This is where it just gets gnarly right here, right? He's going to take the sword and see what happens. But okay, this guy Doeg, the Edomite, all right? Do you guys know anything about the people of Edom? Go ahead, Josiah.
That they are the descendants of Esau.
They're the descendants of Esau, okay. And God specifically says, but they're not in really close relationship with Israel, but since Jacob and Esau are, brothers, then if you remember that in the Genesis account, that the relationship between Jacob and Esau was reconciled. And then further than that, right, remember that where, Jacob is, he comes and Esau comes and he's like really afraid to meet Esau, but then Esau basically is willing to reconcile, and then they reconcile. And so that shows in the biblical account that the people of Edom, which are Esau's descendants, are reconciled with Israel. And the Bible particularly prescribes that Israel weren't supposed to hate the Edomites, okay, the descendants of Esau. However, there was they tend to struggle and battle it out in a lot of different places. There's a lot of prophetic, if you look in the minor prophets specifically, I can't remember the specific ones. I'd have to go through and just think about it for a minute. And I did a study through the minor prophets, but I'd have to think of the specific one. There's a lot of judgment.
It starts with O. What's the
Obed?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Obed. Okay. Yeah, Obed. And so they and so there's actually judgment prescribed upon Edom. It doesn't seem like they're particularly godly, but since Jacob and Esau are brother, they're supposed to work things out. But what we do see is we see a lot of fighting between the Edomites and in Israel. Okay, the Edomites regularly attacked Israel, and then King Saul fought the Edomites. King David subjugated the Edomites and established military garrisons. And so, particularly mountainous region that they had there. I think the city of Petra, the ancient city of Petra, is within Edom, but I just have to make sure about that. Okay. So anyway, that's what's happening. So they don't have, the point here is that Doeg does not have a friendly relationship with the nation of Israel, and that's going to play into this whole account. Okay. We see, though, so this guy's detained before the Lord. Not quite sure in which way that he's detained. Either he has to go through some kind of ceremonial cleansing time, like he did something that was unclean, and now he has to be clean. We see here that he's a servant of Saul, and that he's a chief of the herdsmen. Chief here can have a violent connotation, though, like can be stubborn, obstinate. So, I mean, this guy is a bad dude, and we'll see this as the whole situation unfolds. So he gets the sword, and it's particularly the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And remember that David used the sword before. Do you remember what he used it for? He cut off his head, right? And David says, there's none like it. There's none except that one here. Remember the tabernacle would have like a treasury of wonderful things. We can imagine that the sword of Goliath would be a very wonderful, object to have within the temple treasury. And so he takes it. David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. Now he has this huge sword. Now we see David fleeing into Gath. Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. He changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the door of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Don't you wish you could have seen this? This has been odd. No, not really. Okay. Then Achish said to his servant, look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? Okay. So here we see David going into the town of Gath. You remember who came from the town of Gath? Goliath, of course. Is this a smart move by David? I just have to say, this is not probably one of his better moves, all right? Okay, let's go back to the town where I killed the giant from. It just doesn't seem like the best move in this. And to hide out with the Philistines is also not going to be a good move. We'll see that later on in an even more kind of horrific circumstance. But again, he's out of Israel, so at least he's in his mind, he's thinking, hey, I'm not going to be turned in Israel. I'll go to the land of the Philistines where nobody will come to get me, right? Because now this is in the land of the Philistines. The problem is that the servant of Achish, they remember the victory that David had over Goliath, and they even remember the little ditty that, hit the top 40 tunes, right? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. They're like, wait a second, this is the guy that killed a lot of us. And so, of course, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid. Now again, this man, I don't believe, had any reason to be afraid. He had the sword of Goliath right there. He had the anointing on him as king. I just don't think he had a reason to be afraid at this circumstance. But we do know that he was alone, and that might have made him afraid. And of course, if you and I were in that situation, we would probably be very afraid as well. But again, he has to then orchestrate another deception, which is acting like a madman, which is very interesting because, in a sense, he is acting like a madman. He's already told one lie to Ahimelech. He's already gone to the town in which Goliath was from, and he's acting like a madman, but now he's pretending to act like a madman. The irony of this is just really interesting because these aren't David's best moments, and he's actually pretending the very thing that he is actually acting in. But he acts like he is just mentally insane. He scratches on the door of the gate, let his saliva fall down on his beard. And so you see this man trying to get into Gath. I think that's the idea of scratching on the doors of the gate and, just spittle on his beard, which during that culture, I guess, is just something that just indicates that you're just crazy if you have spittle on your beard. So, Tony, don't do that. Or I don't know what. I'm not quite sure. I'm not really sure what that's all. I'd have to do some more research to see if there's any significance to that. But definitely spit. And during Jesus' day, I remember doing a teaching on John chapter 9 where Jesus mixes the spit and the dirt to heal the man's eyes. Spit was definitely considered unclean, and I'm imagining that in this time it's considered unclean as well. You see, the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? So this deception actually works with the king of Gath. with Achish. And we're no doubt it would work because David is anointed to be king over Israel. And so God's going to get him out of a situation like this. But also we see that this isn't, I believe, that God's plan for his life, for him having to deal with things in this way. So you see David acting insane, which is actually not a valiant action, right? It's kind of a shameful action, and again, another deception to get him out of where he's at. So we see a number of different deceptions that David's executing. We're starting to see that this has become a pattern, and now we're going to see the result of this. It's really interesting is that there's actually a couple Psalms written during this time that shows that he is looking to the Lord. If you look at Psalm 56, for example, let's just turn there together just a few moments. I don't know if I'll read the whole psalm or not. But we see particularly that Psalm 56 is prayer for relief from tormentors. It says it's to the chief musician set to the silent dove in distant lands, a Michtam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. So David, in remembering when the Philistines captured him, actually wrote this incredible psalm. I'll read it. I'll read this one to you. It says, "Be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? All day they twist my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather together. They hide. They mark my steps when they lie in wait for my life. Shall they escape by iniquity? In anger cast down the peoples, O God? You number my wanderings. Put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book? When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know, because God is for me. In God I will praise his word. In the Lord I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Vows made to you are binding upon me, O God. I will render praises to you, for you have delivered my soul from death. Have you not kept my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the land of the living? So even in the situation where he's going through this kind of torment and clouded judgment and such, he really does direct his attention toward the Lord in his inner spiritual life, and we're seeing that. It's kind of a wonderful psalm. One other psalm that's also written regarding this time, though I'm not sure if it was just in the moment or a little bit later on, I would imagine that it was around the time, is Psalm chapter 34, or Psalm 34. A psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. So he actually wrote a psalm out of that experience as well. He says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant. Their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. Isn't that I think that is the money verse right there in that psalm. This poor man cried out, the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. David recognized his poverty, cried out to the Lord heard him and saved him. I mean, that to me is what it was all about. It wasn't that David was perfect. He was a poor man, impoverished even by the deceptions he was telling. But then look how the Lord heard him. And isn't that just a testimony to the grace of God? So both of those psalms written during this time, this emotional time where David's getting delivered from the hand of the Philistines.
What was the second psalm?
34.
So 56 and 34?
Yeah, 56 and 34. Yeah, write those down. Those are good ones to think about. Continuing on, then we go to 1 Samuel chapter 22. It says there that, let me just make sure I got everything there. Okay. And then 22 says this, David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is discontented gathered to him. And so he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men. Okay, so here we see David come to this cave of Adullam. All right, David knows that his father knows his house is in trouble. David's on his own. These guys are going to get it if they don't go with David, and we'll see them go to David. We'll ultimately see them being transferred to another safe kind of holding while David goes through this period of exile. And then we see these 400 men gathered to him. Everyone who is in distress. It's amazing how the Bible lays out this alliteration, though I'm sure it's not like this in the Hebrew. Distress, everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is discontented. All right? So this is David's army here, right? The guys that are just emo, right? They're distressed over some circumstance. They're in debt. They owe a bunch of money, right? And everybody that's discontented, they're just mad about the state of the world. That becomes your army, right? This is your military might at this point. It's like David's like, man, I didn't need like a full-time counseling job, right? So again, but you think about this, he's a shepherd by heart. He's a pastor by heart. That's just the type of guy that he is. And I think these people kind of flocked to him and saw him as their leader and were willing to be ministered to by him. So anyway, and 400 guys is a lot of guys, right? 400 men that are discontented, that are distressed and in debt. And so David was their captain. And then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. So again, he's going to stay them out of harm's way because Saul would come down upon his family in his anger toward David. So he brought them before the king of Moab, and he dwelt there with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Now the prophet Gad said to David, don't stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went to the forest of Hereth. So here we see this prophet just kind of come out of the woodwork. I don't know, it's obviously in Moab. This is just an interesting circumstance anyway. Is this prophet Gad just shows up out of the woodwork, just totally out of the blue. It says, hey, get out of here. Again, showing the favor of David's life is that he wasn't supposed to stay in some kind of stronghold. In fact, he was supposed to get out and kind of just keep on wandering around. And then we finished up the chapter with just a kind of a terrible, just a terrible recounting of what happens to Elimelech and his family and fellow priest. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, with a spear in his hand, again, right? And all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and hundreds? All of you conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob to Elimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistines. So the king sent to Elimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, here I am, Lord. Then Saul said, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you've given him bread and a sword, and inquired of God for him, that he should rise up against me to lie in wait, as it is this day? So Elimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, and who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to any in the house of my father. For your servants knew, sorry about that. For your servants knew nothing of this. For your servant knew nothing of this, little or much. And so we see Elimelech, he's honest and he's not worthy of death here. He just says the honest truth regarding this, and it doesn't matter or not to Saul. Again, we see that Saul's anger and his fear is controlling him, and this is actually going to make it a lot worse for Elimelech and his fellow priest. The king said, "You shall surely die, Elimelech, you and all your father's house." Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David, because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me." But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, "You turn and kill the priests." So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, "I knew that day, when Doeg was there, that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be saved.'" Okay. Again, this is just a terrible circumstance where Saul orders the execution of the priest, and when he should have known that when his servants did not do that killing, that would be just a terribly wrong thing to do, because obviously they believed that these priests were innocent, and they believed that these priests were men of God. And so for those two reasons, I believe they didn't execute them. But that didn't stop Doeg from executing them, though. And then he executes 85 men, which is just a terrible slaughter in Israel, a total stain upon Saul. You're kind of wondering at that point why Saul didn't do it himself, right? If he believed these men were wrong, why didn't he just do it himself? But then he unleashes this monster of a man to kill 85 men, right? Probably husbands and fathers, and then also to execute judgment on Nob, women, children, and nursing infants, where we see this guy just doing a terrible work in the land of Israel, with only one man escaping, or at least one man that we know of escaping, this man Abiathar. Now Abiathar is interesting, is that he's going to be the only guy that will be able to tell David the truth of the matter of what happened there. And then David is able to take responsibility for his sin. It says, "I've caused the death of all the persons of your father's house." And then he offers some protection to Abiathar. "Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe." So at least he takes care of him, and at least the line of Elimelech is able to stay alive by this one man, Abiathar, even in the midst of this terrible slaughter that's happened. Again, this becomes another stain upon Saul's kingship and life, just another in a long line of terrible things that he does. And it's just hard for us to understand how a man can get to that place, but it seems like it's just one little bad decision after another that leads Saul down the path of doing things that he never thought that he'd ever do within his life. And then again, we see David in his bad course of action, just offering those deceptions that he thought would be able to get him out of situations and relieve him and Elimelech by kind of compromising in the area of truth, and how much that cost Elimelech and his family as well, even though he had no idea of what was happening at the time. Again, two courses of action. One bad man acting badly, the Spirit of the Lord deserting him, his anger and his fear ruling him, and then one good man subject to compromise and from deception, but also having to pay a large price for his deception as a matter of a leader. Again, this is not a glorious chapter in the life of David or in the life of Saul, and we'll see how much their failed leadership really cost them in this situation. Any questions? Okay, let's pray. Father, we just want to be the kind of leaders that don't compromise when we're hit with situations and circumstances, when our judgment is clouded and we don't know what to do. I pray that we would be like David and go into the house of the Lord, but that you would let us do that without compromising, that we really ask for godly wisdom that is pure and peaceable, full of mercy and good fruit, willing to yield, just the mercy that's really from above, or the wisdom that's really from above. And God, we need that. We don't pretend that we'd be any better than David or even in Saul. And if our anger or our fear ruled us, or we were given to lies and deceptions, it'd be easy to do those things. And I pray, God, that you keep us from those things. as godly leaders, as there's this young leadership in this room that is being risen up to lead the church, Lord, I pray, Lord, that you would just give them godly wisdom and protect them from the snares of circumstances and clouded judgment and even satanic influence, Lord Jesus. So, Lord, protect us, give us grace, give us hope, and let us look unto you. In Jesus' name, amen.